The United States Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, thus paving the way for more gerrymandering and political cheating, if you ask me. Honestly, in a political system that feels less and less representative of the American people. So, some believe that President Trump has scored a major political victory that could help Republicans minimize their losses in the midterm elections. However, others are arguing that this could backfire and galvanize Democratic voters. Now, before we get to the details, Cenk, your 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that it's a bit of a disaster. And I think the most important point is one that isn't partisan. I'll get back to that in a minute.
Let's first touch base with the Voting Rights Act, make sure we're all on the same page in understanding what that is before we move on to get to that Supreme Court ruling. So the Voting Rights Act sought to end Jim Crow era discrimination in our political system. So specifically, the law sought to end obstacles that Black Americans, Black voters were facing when it came to casting their own ballots. It also has something to do with gerrymandering, right? And in this particular Supreme Court case, the topic of drawing up districts based on racial demographics is what was being challenged. So late last month, the Voting Rights Act was effectively dismantled by the Supreme Court. They ruled that it is illegal or against the Constitution for lawmakers in the state of Louisiana to essentially create a new majority Black congressional district. Now, unsurprisingly, this ruling was split along ideological lines. It did pass 6-3, meaning the 6 conservative justices voted in favor of doing away with the Voting Rights Act. Now, Jonathan Martin from Politico said of the decision, the Supreme Court may argue in gutting the Voting Rights Act that they're creating race-neutral districts, but the practical reality of what this means is starring political leaders and, more to the point, Black voters in the face, staring. White Republicans fracturing African American districts to unseat mostly Black Democrats so they can elect more white Republicans. So that was Jonathan Martin's take. Before I give you more details on this, do you agree with that take, Cenk? Do you think that's what's gonna happen here? Are they gonna dilute these majority Black districts and draw up districts that essentially will be more favorable to white Republicans?
Definitely, that's not a question. Yeah, and they know that, everybody knows that. So the question is, do you choose to emphasize the white part or the Republican part? Because the Supreme Court said, we're not gonna emphasize the white part. We're gonna say they're picking based on Republicans, so you're allowed to pick based on politics, hence it's okay.
But why? Why are they allowed to? Look, I think gerrymandering is wrong, period. I think all of it should stop, okay? Yeah. But it's not going to. And so why is gerrymandering to help a political party cheat somehow constitutional, but drawing up districts based on racial makeup isn't?
So the Supreme Court isn't entirely wrong about that, with a giant asterisk, right? So they say, look, how you pick your congressional districts is a political question. It's not a question for the Supreme Court. It's a question for the different states to determine. That's a very fair point for them to make, okay? Now, the problem was, the reason why they passed the Voting Rights Act is because the southern states back in the day were saying, oh, okay, then if it's a political question, I'm gonna draw it up so that there'll be no Black representatives. There'll be nobody who is in favor of integration, or will only make segregationist districts. And then Congress had to come in overall and go, no, the southern states are not allowed to do that because we can tell that you're picking based on race. And back then it was purely based on race, right? So they had to address that, they didn't have a choice. Now, at the same time, I would say, as with all of affirmative action, there has to come a time when we stop doing that, right? When we stop picking based on race, whether it's to help white folks or to help Black folks or to help anyone, right? So, but we can't do that as long as gerrymandering exists.
Exactly, that's the point that I'm trying to make. I'm not saying that I find it to be okay to draw up districts simply based on race. But I also think in a environment where that's considered unconstitutional, then gerrymandering, which I sum up as political cheating, should be outlawed, period.
Yeah, there's no question. So that leads back to the asterisk, the giant one, right? So the Supreme Court ruled in Bush v. Gore in 2000 that, hey, every vote in every state has to be equal to one another. That's why we've got to stop the counting in Florida. Because of the irregularities there, we're worried that they're going to have an outsized influence and their votes are going to be different and more impactful than a vote in Wisconsin or Wyoming, right? Now, I think they cheated massively in that case. They violated their own states' rights principles, et cetera. But that is a precedent now, okay? And so I would use that precedent to say, no, gerrymandering is unconstitutional, because it means that our votes are not equal.
Exactly.
In fact, our votes in a gerrymandered district are nearly pointless, worthless.
Yes.
Right? That comes with an asterisk too, which we'll come back to. But that would be an excellent case to declare gerrymandering unconstitutional overall.
No, finish your thought, because I'm super engaged in what you're saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
So now the reason why that has an asterisk is, okay, so we want to get rid of gerrymandering because it's splitting up our votes. Shoot, you made me stop and then I forgot the second asterisk. So you keep going and I'll come back to the
all right, so
second
let's get back to this. Now, there are, of course, some conservatives, including this conservative lawyer, Hans von Spakovsky, who, by the way, served in George W. Bush's administration. They're praising the Supreme Court's decision here. So why don't we take a listen and see if he says anything that persuades us?
What happens if a consequence of this decision is fewer black members of Congress?
Well, if they want to get someone elected, look, if they affiliate with the Republican Party, black candidates will get elected. We've seen that.
So they have to become a Republican in some of these red states to have a chance of winning?
The point of our Constitution and the Voting Rights Act is that everyone is guaranteed an equal opportunity to vote. They are not guaranteed success in the candidates that they think should be elected.
So apparently Trump is calling for unity after another violent incident. But the way this gets covered depends on who's trying to spin it and who's willing to call it out. On the right, the framing turns Trump into some kind of heroic victim, a uniquely important figure being targeted because he's just that powerful. On the left, the focus is on Trump's long, obvious relationship with violent rhetoric and the political climate he helped create. Same event, completely different narrative. And that is exactly why I recommend Ground News. It's a website and app that pulls together reporting from across the political spectrum so you can compare headlines side by side, see the bias distribution of the coverage, check the factuality ratings of the sources, and even see who owns the outlets behind the reporting. Because once you start looking at coverage that way, it becomes a lot easier to see when the media isn't informing you, it's managing your perception. Ground News also has a blind spot feed, which highlights stories that one side of the political spectrum is barely covering at all, so you're not trapped inside the version of events your media bubble wants you to accept. If you're tired of being fed somebody else's narrative, I genuinely recommend Ground News. Go to ground.news/TYT or scan the QR code to get 40% off Ground News Vantage Plan. And look, I could be wrong about this, but I feel like there's a lot of assumption going into the commentary surrounding this story, like the assumption that, let's say you have a majority black district, they're only interested in voting for black candidates. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think they're interested in voting for people who represent their best interests. Like, it's not that complicated. But anyway, what do you think about what he said there, Cenk?
Yeah, so on the surface, equal opportunity to vote sounds great. I'm totally in favor of that. But what he's actually doing by backing gerrymandering is ending your equal opportunity to vote. And think about it, if you gerrymander, to some degree, it has to be racial. Why do I say that? Because the parties now have been so divided on racial lines, not completely, but especially with African Americans, nearly completely, that if you say, hey, I'm eliminating Democratic districts, almost by definition, especially in the South, you're getting rid of black districts, right? So, and if you say, hey, by the way, I'm gonna add black districts because it's proportional to their population in the state, well, there's a lot of fairness to that because it's proportional, but then you would be getting rid of some districts that were represented probably, very, very, very likely by white representatives. So the minute you have gerrymandering, the racial issue becomes impossible to avoid. So how do you avoid it? You end gerrymandering. And so then you have logical districts where there's black people, white people, Asian people, and then you can't complain, well, I need more black representatives in this state. No, you need to win those elections,
exactly,
okay?
yeah.
And if they happen to be black, great, love it, right? But they don't need to be black as long as the elections and the districts are fair, right? So gerrymandering makes the districts unfair by definition. And if you're not aware and you still think it's a partisan issue, remember in the blue states, we also gerrymander, so the Republicans have almost no voice, right? California, we're about to wipe out almost every Republican there is in a gigantic state, right? Yeah. And are there Republican voters in the state? Of course there are.
Who are gonna be disenfranchised by that.
Yeah, 35, 40% of the voters, that's tens of millions of people disenfranchised in California who are Republicans. And obviously that goes true for Democrats and black voters in the South and in many other areas as well. And finally, the asterisk that I was talking about, Anna, is, look, that was in regards to how it's gonna affect elections. So the Republicans think, oh great, we're wiping out all the Democratic districts. But hold, what you're doing is you're spreading your voters even thinner, right? Because in order to have more Republican districts, if you had a district that was 70% Republican, you've got to distribute like 15% of that to another district so you could win a second district. But now you've made that district only 55% Republican.
God,
Do you see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. And this is part of the reason why I'm black-pilled, right? I mean, people are up in arms about this story, as they should be, because it's a further dismantling of our democratic process. I get that. At the same time, our democratic process has yielded fewer and fewer benefits for the American people each election cycle. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I just hate all of this, and I do think that gerrymandering should be banned. If you're gonna pass down a ruling like this, all you're doing is putting a weird Band-Aid on a gushing wound that undermines our democratic process. Do away with the gerrymandering. That is what should be challenged in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so last two things for me is that Hans von Spansky guy has been spanking it over like getting rid of your ability to vote since the Bush era. I covered him 20 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, and he hates the idea of fair elections. So it's so ironic when mainstream media brings him on. Tell us about fair elections, Hans von Spansky, who spanks to unfair elections. Okay, it's just like the greatest irony there is. And remember, why is he so animated by that? Because he's a right winger or he's a Republican? No, because he's part of the establishment and they love taking your votes away and they love taking your power away. They don't want the grassroots deciding on the Republican side or the Democratic side. So guys, the best description of gerrymandering is, instead of the voters picking their politicians, the politicians get to pick their voters. Once the politicians pick their voters, we're screwed. None of our votes have any meaning at all. It's all one big joke. We must end gerrymandering for everyone.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.